English translation, 246th contact. Saturday, 19th of June, 1993, 23:17 hours.
Edward, hello, my friend.
Ptah, this is a pleasure and a surprise. Where are you?
Here I am standing behind the spruces. So here I am. It is nice to meet you here. Outside it is quite pleasant now.
I think so too. If you want, we can stay out here, but maybe we should go forward to the biotope. We could also sit down there, because we have installed various seating areas at the rest area.
I know, so let us go.
You were absent for a long time, my friend.
It was not possible for me to be absent from my task, because my presence was desperately needed.
If you had such important things to do. But I am pleased nevertheless that you found time to visit me again.
It was really very important, and my presence was indeed imperative. My task was to create a colony on an uninhabited planet called Cathan in the space area IDAM. Known on Earth in this space-time structure as the spiral nebula NGC 2997 at a distance of 45 million light-years. I was also busy in the space area Nosir, where we also founded a new colony. This also happened on an uninhabited planet called Nasadan. The space region Nosir is a galaxy which is 16 million light-years away from the SOL system in this space-time structure, and which is referred to as M83 in earthly astronomy science.
Then the spiral nebula and the galaxy are not in your space-time structure, if I have understood correctly. However, the question remains as to why you are founding colonies if you have enough space on your planet, since you do not tend towards overpopulation, as is the case on the Earth.
The colonies were founded to separate two enemy races that threatened to destroy each other on their home planets by waging endless war against each other. Capable of both nuclear technology and the first spaceflight, they attacked each other's planets and brought them very close to the danger of destruction. And since our Federation is in charge of these two planets and of the inhabitants, we decided, according to the advice of the High Council, to transplant the two contentious peoples in order to guarantee their continued existence to the other and peace-loving peoples of the two planets. They also dominate the first spaceflight, but they do not pose any danger. However, the fallible ones, 124 million of one people and 106 million of the other, were transferred to the planets I mentioned in the space areas IDAM and Nosir, where they will live from now on without knowing the whereabouts of the other people. Moreover, it is impossible for the transplanted ones of both peoples to fly to other planets for many hundreds of years to come, because care was taken to ensure that the next inhabited planets are more than 130 light-years away from the colonies, so that they cannot be reached by the resettled ones. On the one hand, because their space technology is only just developed to the extent that distances of at most 430 million kilometers can be covered, while the age of the colonists is still very low with an average of 83 years.
Very interesting, and here we are. This is where we can sit down. What you have told me is really very interesting, but it leads me to a question if you are allowed to answer it. In addition to what Sim Yase once told me about why you do not officially land on the Earth and do not make contact, there are other reasons. You yourself once told me, in confidence, that you still had certain directives that you had to obey, but that were not allowed to be officially talked about at that time. Is it now perhaps possible that we can talk about it, and in such a form that it may also be public?
The time is ripe for it, so there are no more obstacles to it.
Then correct me when I say something that does not correspond to the facts. Your explanation was that a very important, or the most important directive at all states, in reference to interfering, making contact, or simply making oneself officially recognizable to human beings and populations, That this is absolutely forbidden to you and, so to speak, forbidden if the human beings or populations are not in the same situation. The population of a planet itself is not yet so powerful in space technology that it has come into contact with further human life, etc. by its own power on foreign planets, or that the humanity concerned or the human beings as a whole have not progressed so far in their development. That they would regard the existence of other human life forms on foreign planets in the immense vastness of the world as an absolute fact and actuality in conviction, namely in the collective. If therefore only individual humans or smaller or larger groups are of this conviction, then the possibility of an establishment of contact, etc., is not given, because the knowledge and the conviction must collectively concern the entire humankind. Is that correct?
What you say corresponds exactly to the meaning of our main directive with regard to making contact, interfering and making oneself known in public form with regard to human beings and populations of planets, whose technology or knowledge does not yet correspond to the value of a decisive spaceflight to other human forms of life, or that the state of general knowledge and the conviction of human beings is not yet so far advance that uniformly and collectively the knowledge of the existence of further human life on foreign planets is given in the vastness of the cosmos.
Thank you. But how about your visit to Simya, Say, and Ascot, etc.? Were you there? And were you able to bring me the medals?
My daughter sends you good and dear greetings, equally Ascot and Nera and all the others you know there. Also, Quetzal and all others send you their greetings. Soon it will be so far with our new technology that you can visit my daughter. And of course I brought you the metal samples. They are already in 2 small containers in your workroom, in the white box next to your typewriter. Please remove them from the container so I can take them back. The multicolored metal is a still unfinished alloy, which, as with us, is also used by Ascot's people in the Dal universe as a thin coating for all types of flying objects and flying devices. With the other and shining silver metal, it is almost pure silver, which forms one of the basic materials for the alloy, which consists of 2 further parts of copper and nickel. I will put some more of the silver pieces in your workroom in the next few days, so you can sell some if you are willing. Buyers can certainly be found for this, because who on the earth already owns a piece of silver from a foreign universe?
That should not be possible, my friend, because on the one hand, they would not believe me, and on the other hand, they would accuse me of fraud and take me to court. How could I also prove that the metals really come from the Dal universe? That is simply impossible here on the Earth. Quite apart from the fact that even a piece of metal the size of a needle's head from a foreign universe on the Earth is practically priceless.
Your concerns might actually be of correctness. I had not thought of that in any manner. But I will still bring you the little remainder and put it in your workroom.
Thank you very much. If I may harass you with some questions?
Of course.
All these years we have talked very often about sightings of extraterrestrial aircraft, and about those humans who claim to have contact with extraterrestrial life forms, and even with extraterrestrial humans. The rule being that many sightings only correspond to imaginations or deceptions, while alleged contacts with aliens are only bragging, lying, swindle, charlatanism, and fraud, with a few exceptions where terrestrial humans were practically forcibly contacted by extraterrestrial beings, most of the time making those contacted helpless, after which they were subjected to tests and investigations. In one issue of a magazine, various reports are listed in which Germans claim, "We also met the aliens." I had this issue of magazine 2000 picked up for you so that you could see it. Was that possible for you?
Certainly. The magazine was handed over to me as well as the video film about the TV show of Rainer Holby. I must explain that both the allegations in this magazine and the allegations in Holb's show are free inventions, some of which have the touch of charlatanry and some of which have the touch of lies, deception, and fraud. Not one of the allegations about UFO encounters or UFO contacts, as you call it, is true, neither in this magazine 2000 nor in Rainer Holby's program.
That was to be expected. Because on a private basis, swindles, lies, charlatanry, and fraud have been practiced in these matters for a long time, which, according to your statements, should increase in the future. Unfortunately, this also discredits and ridicules the real UFO observations, if we want to stick to this name. But there are other UFO observations, namely those that fall within the scope of official and military secrets. This also involves various events of the past and present, about which a great deal has been written, claimed, talked about, and kept secret in the private sphere of so-called UFO research. Stories about crashes and salvages of UFOs also appear, for example the case of New Mexico towards the end of the 1940s, etc. But also names like Falcon and Condor, etc. play an important role, whereby it should concern CIA members, etc., who should pass on UFO information to the public under these pseudonyms, of course, without letting their face become recognizable. Also, the so-called Little Greys play a very important role, who are said to have harassed, impregnated, and maltreated about 3 million people in the USA with surgical scars and markings, etc.
Which, of course, is sheer nonsense and has no reality at all. We are well aware of the hysteria of such delusions in America. This is already spreading to Europe, with a particularly fertile soil to be found, especially in Germany. On the other hand, the delusion and the hysteria are still consciously stirred up from different places, whereby also this Falcon appears, whose false information is gladly taken by all stupid believers at face value. Certain official bodies, offices, and organizations also deliberately allow such false information to be disseminated, whereby the reasons for this are very varied. I am not yet allowed to speak openly about this, nor about which things correspond to the truth or untruth in matters of UFO crashes and UFO salvages, as well as other related matters. Also, with regard to the clarification of earthly offices and military and defensive forces in matters of UFOs, my duty of secrecy, which is apparent from one of our directives, is that we must not interfere in any matters of human life with which we are not in official contact. So we must also keep in mind that we must not decipher secrets that are kept by earthly authorities, government officials, security organizations, the military, etc., which secrets the earthly authorities and military as well as security organizations guard, etc., regarding interests of allegedly extraterrestrial aircraft and humans, etc., must, according to our directive instructions, remain their secrets, which we do not have the right to air.
Well, that is clear. Thus, I do not want to ask you any more about these things. From your explanation, it should be very clear, however, that the Scandinavian aviation major Peterson is also a fantasist in matters concerning the fact that extraterrestrials are supposed to hold important offices in the most diverse earthly governments.
We have also talked about this on several occasions, but we have always made it clear that such assertions correspond to nothing other than pure delusional fantasies.
You said that again and again, yes. Then a question about the hills in the USA, who had been abducted by life forms of extraterrestrial origin, namely by human beings from the area of the stars Zeta Reticuli, 37 light-years away. I believe that you told me at the time that this was correct.
Yes. This forced contact is also the origin of the nonsensical stories and hysteria about the Little Greys, which have nothing to do with the truth in any manner. The fear and hysteria and the imaginative stories about the little grays correspond to a well-managed false propaganda to put certain things in a false light, on the one hand, and to conceal certain events and machinations on the other.
What is certain is that there are inhabited planets in the area of Zeta Reticuli, planets inhabited by humans. Does this apply to both Zeta Reticuli 1 and Zeta Reticuli 2?
This is true, but we do not maintain any contacts with the local inhabitants, who are not even aware of our existence, which we have been observing for several millennia. However, our interests do not lie in establishing contact with the life forms of those areas, since they do not yet possess certain forms of development that would be necessary for establishing contact.
Probably in reference to your directives.
That is right.
Then another question. The magazine 2000, which has already been discussed, claims that the AIDS epidemic is a disease caused by researchers, whereby the German pop singer Christian Anders, who has now adopted the fantasy name Lanu, which supposedly means pupil of the esoteric sciences, is particularly strong for this assertion. He calls himself a theosophist as a follower of Helena Blavatsky. His incredibly absurd nonsense in reference to the development of the AIDS epidemic is that the WHO, the World Health Organization, had planned and produced AIDS in order to practically destroy the overpopulation of the Earth, etc. What do you think?
Absurd nonsense, as you already said. A long time ago, we talked thoroughly about the real origin and development of the AIDS epidemic and clarified the facts of the truth.
I know, but while we are at it, will the AIDS epidemic continue to spread and get worse? And what about Earth disturbances, storms, volcanic eruptions, and earthquakes, etc.?
The increase in the AIDS epidemic will take on ever greater forms, as will natural disasters. Thunderstorms, droughts, floods, volcanic activity, and earthquakes will continue to increase, even if there is some peace in one case or another at the moment.
And what do you say about the atrocities in former Yugoslavia?
It is not worth saying more about this, nor about the irresponsibility and ridiculousness of the UN, nor about all those who oppose this force's peacekeeping operations like NATO in the style of Haneke's multinational peacekeepers. Whoever is against it is a denier of responsibility and a hangman of humankind. Only by the production and employment of multinational peacekeeping troops can the earth be finally pacified. What about the UNO, the NATO, and the different individual countries like, for example, Germany and America, etc.? Is nothing more than a tremendous hypocrisy, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a more and more circumspect depravity of the already blatantly prevalent false humanity, which has taken possession of human beings all over the world, and which is also decisively to blame for the inexorably increasing overpopulation, along with the madness of religions and the blinded, hypocritical Pope of the Catholic Church, who continue to demand from earthly people and preach to them that they should reproduce, etc., facts by which earthly humankind in its overpopulation is so overboard that the impending downfall is already evident.
In 1978, I wrote the book Existent Life in the Universe, which we will soon be able to print and produce as a book. As the last chapter, I named and described the problem of overpopulation on the Earth. We have now turned this chapter into a small script entitled The Battle of Overpopulation. It is the same work that I sent in 1956 to all European radio stations and to all editorial offices of the most renowned newspapers in Europe, America, Asia, and Africa, but never received an answer. The writing at that time was a bit different in reference to dates, etc., because these were different at that time, but on the whole, it is the same writing. And when, in the 1950s, I talked about the threatening problem of overpopulation, I was ridiculed and called a pessimist, probably because nobody had recognized the problem then. but now we meet with resonance when we talk about it. And this is also the case with our large-scale action, because we send the battle of overpopulation script to many thousands all over the world, to radio and television stations, to all kinds of newspapers and organizations, and to all governments on the earth. I think that it is finally time to shake up humanity, and also to teach truth to all responsible human beings and hypocritical false humanists, as well as other irresponsible humans, etc., which of course will lead to them reacting very badly, as has already happened in a few cases.
In 1956, you were actually the first and only person on the Earth to proceed in the form you mentioned with regard to overpopulation. But in fact, you have not been paid any attention and you have been exposed to ridicule. Neither radio nor newspapers have reacted, nor have governments or organizations. I can remember it very well, and your writing has been well known to me since then. Your 1978 book with the corresponding chapter on overpopulation is also in my possession, as is the latest writing you have brought me. So everything is well known to me, and I know very well what efforts you have taken on for everything. Nevertheless, it will once again be the case that you will not be honored for it. Because, as usual, other and glorious earthlings will dispute your honor with the assertion that they recognized the overpopulation problem long before you and tried to tackle it. For my part, however, I know that you already discussed these problems with Svath when you were still a boy, and nobody had yet recognized the threat of growing overpopulation. And if you now again spread your writing and go against the overpopulation, then this is really urgently necessary and about time. So you are really doing it.
Today I have much better possibilities for this, in terms of the production of the writings, as well as the finances and other help provided mainly by the core group members. The reactions to my writing are good in themselves, except for the few exceptions of irresponsible people, false humanists and autocrats, etc., who refuse to do so for reasons of self-interest and false humanism, whereby especially the measures for overpopulation containment are criticized, because the stinkers do not like the radical measures. But the fact that only rigorous radical measures can really help to prevent the final catastrophe really cannot be argued about. For my part, I have calculated that it would take 100 years to reduce humanity to a level of 2.5 billion 2,500,000 humans through the radical measures mentioned in my writing, if natural deaths are added to this. Today, according to your data, we have 5.8 billion 5,800,000 human beings on the Earth, while the statisticians of Earth humans claim that it is only their 5.5 billion 5,500,000. But to reduce this mass by radical measures would only bring the mentioned success if it was started immediately. But the radical measures, as these are called in the battle of overpopulation, would have to be carried out really rigorously, and from now on unrestrictedly, in order to then be adhered to as long as humankind on the Earth would have only 529 million, which corresponds to the mass that can be nourished by Earth without problems and in abundance.
I agree with your interpretations.
Well, then we can talk about something else again. My question refers once more to alleged contacts of Earth humans with extraterrestrials, whereby the specific is directed at claims which, in my opinion, sound quite ridiculous. Apart from the approximately 3 million humans in America who were allegedly harmed by extraterrestrials and subjected to all kinds of tests, whereby many women supposedly developed pregnancies, and the little Greys allegedly then stole the hybrid children after the birth. After the tests, the kidnapped and harmed Earth humans would have often suffered from pain and complained about operation scars and burn marks, etc. In addition, however, cows and cattle are also said to have been outrageously massacred by the little Greys, and namely also in the thousands and millions, whereby the beasts were allegedly also missing various organs, and, at the same time, mysterious things are said to have occurred as well.
This, of course, does not correspond to the truth, but to an unbelievable nonsense, which fanatical or otherwise incapable UFO and ghost believers only too gladly want to recognize as real truth and believe in it rock solidly, although not a word of the whole dizziness corresponds to the truth, which is very consciously invented and controlled by certain agencies for deception and scaremongering in order to achieve certain goals. In addition to these agencies and persons, however, there are still many UFO fantasists, most of whom are burdened by sectarianism, who self-harm their bodies by giving themselves wounds and burns, etc., implanting crystals or pieces of metal in their flesh and leaving everything scarred, in order to then claim that they have been abducted and harmed by extraterrestrials, to which the scars and burns, etc., would testify. Incompetent hypnotists, who then subject such persons to so-called truth hypnoses, then claim that the information given in hypnosis by the hypnotized would unfailingly correspond to the truth, because hypnosis could not lie. However, it is never taken into account that a person in a hypnotic state can tell and pronounce the worst lies just as untraceably as is the case with the so-called technical lie detectors, without the specialists being able to recognize the lies, because the technical devices of this kind on the Earth are still so imperfect that they can be outwitted with simple and inherent human means. With regard to the allegedly massacred animals, it must be said that this is just as much unbelievable nonsense as the alleged pregnancies in American women caused by the little grays. The massacred animals are also purely Earth-human machinations for the purpose of scaremongering and misleading all those who are incompetent in the matter of UFO matters, ghosts and extraterrestrials, and simply believe all nonsense unthinkingly when it concerns extraterrestrials and their flying machines or ghosts or religious apparitions and other imaginings, etc. In some cases, however, no terrestrial humans are involved in such events, but predators who tear and mutilate the cattle.
Thank you. Now a question, which refers to you, that is to say, to your names. Can you tell me how often the names Ptah, Simya, Seta, Quetzal, Svath, and Plagia appear in your mind?
First, I want to answer the previous question to its end, because there is still to explain that many UFO fantasists and the like use existing old scars, marks, and other things on their bodies to also actually claim that these signs originated from harmings, tests and operations of extraterrestrials, by which they were kidnapped, etc. Recently, this has also become apparent among various people in Europe, especially in Germany, where the little grays hysteria is also beginning to take root, as I have already explained to you. The reason why these swindles, frauds, lies, and charlatanry are becoming more and more widespread in Europe is often the fault of those very elements who spread such stories in public in a lying, fraudulent or swindling and charlatan-based manner. Their number in Europe, especially in Germany, is constantly growing, and unintelligently, the television stations still lend a helping hand to these phonies, liars, swindlers, and charlatans, etc., by devoting their programs to them, through which the incredible nonsense of the phonies, conceited and delusional ones, is broadcast to all countries, whereby the viewers are misinformed and misdirected, and whereby, in turn, new fantasists, deceivers, charlatans, sectarians, and delusionaries, etc. arise. Journals also contribute to this, such as the magazine you sent me and many others of the same kind, thousands of which are produced and distributed all over the world, read by misguided and faith-dependent people and taken at face value. And if you follow all these things, then you will find their origin in America, a country in which all sectarianism thrives, and as a rule also finds its beginning. and a country in which innumerable people have fallen in love with the most diverse forms of sectarianism in such a manner that their belief in it no longer allows any truth to come into its own. The delusional faith of the believers, which also includes the UFO fantasists, UFO insane ones, UFO fanatics, ghost believers and crop circle believers, as well as all other believers, fanatics and insane ones who believe in unreal things, in no wise allows them to accept even iota of the actual truth. They all want to be deceived because they are not stable and not mature enough to take their lives into their own hands. Truthfully, they seek the entire responsibility in higher levels. With a God, with angels and saints, as well as with spirits and extraterrestrials, etc., to whom they are so firmly attached in faith that any attempt to explain the truth to them is almost hopeless. The same thing, also taken over by U.S. America, is spreading more and more also in Europe, whereby in this respect the whole European continent is already seized by it, respectively the human beings living on this continent. Originally, all this rests in the freedom of the people and the individual, which was misunderstood by the Americans, from which the unbelievable self-estimation of the Americans was formed, whereby they are of the assumption that they are the best and most authoritative people on the earth. This is also expressed in all those cases in which the Americans interfere in the dealings with foreign peoples and countries, to which they have no right whatsoever, nor in the advocacy and practice of the death penalty. Only by interfering in the dealings of foreign peoples, where they have no right whatsoever, as well as by advocating and applying the death penalty, they place themselves higher than the creation itself, which, from the very beginning, would never have dared to place itself above life and death in such a wise that death would have been conceived and manifested as a punishment for any shameful act of a life form. With the mere advocacy and application of the death penalty both for criminal acts and for political machinations, etc., the Americans rank themselves higher than the creation itself, thus blaspheming creation. Of course, China and all other states of the world which equally advocate and exercise the death penalty should also be mentioned in this regard. But in this form, U.S. America actually surpasses all others because it knows no boundaries in self-glory. This is also one of the most important reasons why we and nobody from our Federation have ever made contact with any human beings in U.S. America, which we will continue to do in no wise. We were satisfied with the attempt at that time, where we wanted to get in touch with the American government, but which we had to abort already in the beginning, because the megalomaniac and high-handed demands of all those who had been approached in the USA and were involved in the attempt were simply unfulfillable and unacceptable.
Long speech, my friend. But what about the names Simya, Se, Ptah, Quetzal, Sfath, and Plagia? How often do they appear in your newspapers? Are these with you common names like Hans and Harry, etc. with us?
Of course, you asked me about that. No, these names are no longer common and therefore not frequent. The names you mentioned only appear once each, so for my daughters Simya, Se, and Plagia, as well as for me, Ptah and Quetzal. The name Sfath no longer exists at all. So it is the same case with these names as it is with the names of your children, and with some of the children of your group members who have chosen old names from your name books for their descendants.
Then the names only exist once in your entire Federation.
That corresponds to the meaning of my words.
And how is that possible?
The names mentioned have been handed down and preserved in our family and in Quetzal's since ancient times, because they have historically important meanings. This is limited to our family and Quetzal's family. All other families and people of our home planet era have different and more modern names. While the non-Pleiar and federated peoples, human beings, and families naturally have names that have nothing to do with the Pleiaran or the old Lyran ones.
Interesting but also enlightening, because it makes it clear that neither an FB, a PL, a GG, or a RB, or any other terrestrial human being can have contact with one of the aforementioned. Since you, as well as Quetzal, Plasia, and Simya, declare that you are not in contact with any terrestrial human being or connected in any other manner with any of them, apart from me. As Quetzal once explained to me, you, who we have just named by name, do not exercise any impulse contacts in any kind and wise which are unconsciously taken up by Earth humans, etc., because such impulse contacts are made solely by apparatuses, because these are not subjected to any feelings and emotions, etc., as is the case with human beings.
Yes, your words correspond in every detail to the circumstances.
The mentioned liars, swindlers, and cheaters, as well as several unnamed ones, unfortunately still work around with their stories of lies. Also, GG with his fantasy figure Hatun, etc., as I was told by telephone from US America.
He is nothing more than an infamous liar and cheater who is fully aware of his lying and cheating. The fantasy word Hatun is probably just as much a pure invention of his own pathological prestige addiction as all the incredibly stupid scribbling he spreads. The fantasy word Hatun also does not exist as a name in our language nor in any other language of our Federation. An inquiry by the High Council at the Arahat Athersata level also revealed that the stupid word Hatun only exists in the entire universe on the Earth, or in the stories of lies and deceit of GG, but nowhere else.
Typically US Americans, megalomaniacal, and lying to the point of no return, whereby of course I always speak only of those who fall within this framework. Because of course there are also other and extremely righteous people in America who do not agree with all that is wrong, degenerate, and incorrect. But from these human beings one hears, unfortunately, nothing or only very rarely something, because evil prevails and appears more often than good. In particular, I am thinking of the death penalty practiced in America, and the insolence and deceit of those who carry out murderous actions of a political nature in foreign states, which are absolutely unjustified.
It is very interesting that you are talking about this, because such an event is already in the offing again, namely in Iraq. It will be the night from the 26th to the 27th of June of the current month, when such an autocratic machination of the Americans will take place again. As years ago the Israelis invaded Iraq with fighter bombers and allegedly bombed nuclear plants being built there and earned the praise of the misguided world, the Americans will play the same game in the night from the 26th to the 27th of June, under the guise of a retaliatory strike against Iraq, for a murder plot against former President George Bush by the Iraqis at the time of the Gulf debacle. The truth is that the coming event is an autocratic and megalomaniac act of revenge by the Americans, especially President Bill Clinton, because several of the rulers feel hurt in their autocracy. The Americans will fire 23 cruise missiles, and so Raketen, at the Iraqi intelligence headquarters in Baghdad, but some will miss their target and kill innocent people. A typical American act of megalomania and autocracy of vengeance, injured false pride, and injured autocracy and false liberty, as expressed blatantly by the practice of the death penalty in America. Self-righteously, they take the false liberty and the false right to practice cowardly and treacherous justice and to destroy human lives, to destroy much, and to practice vindictiveness. If that had happened during the Gulf War, which will happen in 8 days, then everything could have been considered a justified retaliation and an inevitable consequence of the war, as well as an act of emergency. But what will happen next Saturday night has no more justification because it is only a pure autocratic and megalomaniac act of revenge.
Well said, but now something completely different. At the beginning of my contact with Sim Ya-se, I once asked her about the mammoth, which lived on the Earth until about 8,000 years ago, whereby North America, in particular, is to be mentioned in this respect, where it finally appeared in smaller herds. Sim Ya-se said at that time that the mammoth was the only form of life that had teeth that were directed in different directions, one large curved tooth pointing upwards and the other downwards. Subsequently, which unfortunately was not mentioned in that contact report, she explained to me that these teeth did not carry the actual mammoth, which is generally known, but a so-called early mammoth, which, if I remember correctly, was called Pangara or Pangira, and which belongs to the genus Dinotherium, that is to say, Dinotherium, which are also known as mastodons and which populated Earth for about 25 million years, and were the first precursors of the proboscideans, and especially of mammoths and elephants. But it was also only one species of the genus Dinotherium, which had the curiosity of a tooth bent upwards and downwards, both of which were attached to the upper jaw. Is this true? I was asked a question that answered this question, which I answered in this form, trusting that Sim Ya-se had actually explained things to me correctly, which I have no doubt about.
There is also no reason to doubt my daughter's statement, because in fact the facts are given as you just called them, only that they are not known or only partly known by earthly paleontologists.
Then again, a next question. You once explained to me that in the entire universe there exists 280 elements, after Guido came across them through calculations. I then calculated that the original pyramid height of the Pyramid of Giza was 152.9555347 meters, which you confirmed to me. You also said that today's height of about 136.8 meters was due to the fact that the ancient Egyptians, etc., had removed so much material from the pyramid that it had shrunk so much. Well, earthly scientists claim that the Great Pyramid of Giza originally had a height of 146.6 meters, but according to my calculations and your statements, this does not correspond to the truth. The original height was actually 152.9555347 meters, which was renamed in kilometers and corresponds exactly to the Earth-Sun distance, and thus to an AE, an astronomical unit. A fact which contradicts the inaccurate distance indication of Earth-Sun by Earth astronomic science. Interesting is now the further computation, which I made at that time, namely that from the exact pyramid height and/or from the exact Earth-Sun distance Earth-Sun, and with the number of the total elements of 280, today's very exact speed of light can be calculated. If one consults the multiplication factor 7, the calculation then reads as follows: 280 x 7, 1960, how 152.95537, 299, 792.488012. So the end result is today's speed of light, which is 299,792.4812 kilometers per second. At that time, I was not allowed to publish this calculation, nor the exact number of elements. The question is now whether these calculations made by me must still be subject to secrecy, or whether one may speak openly about it now.
There are no more reasons for further secrecy.
Well, then something else again. I am of the opinion that one should always help where this help is appropriate, which is why I also founded the Russia Aid. In this respect, I am of the opinion that the people in Russia deserve help very well, because they are very hard-working and not warmongering. They also strive very hard for a very good education and for knowledge and the acquisition of foreign languages, etc., etc., which cannot be said, for example, of the Americans who have an extremely poor education, both in professional and in general education, and only very rarely master a foreign language. The same can also be said of certain other countries, but only to a much lesser extent. But I actually want to point to something else, namely the former Yugoslavia, because there, I think, any assistance is absolutely out of place. Any assistance in any form is only used to be able to continue the war. No matter what kind of assistance it is, so not only weapons, but also medicines and food, serve to be able to continue the war, whereby human beings, adults and children, are massacred and slaughtered. In my view, none of the fighting parties is better than the other, whether they are Christians or Muslims, Croats, Bosnians, or Serbs, and so on. If one helps any party or ethnic group, etc., then they only accept the help in order to become stronger again, and to come to the top, in order to gain new power, after which they can then, strengthened, set off again against their adversaries and strike out, so that no end to the entire misery can be foreseen. I think that it is absolutely irresponsible and even criminal to help warring parties and peoples, etc. in any form, because all misery, all killing, murdering, massacring, and slaughtering will only be carried on. But it is also the same with the irresponsible hunger aid that is provided worldwide. All those hungry people who have been irresponsibly bred in the famine countries, who have been raised and made strong again by hunger aid, continue to breed irresponsibly new offspring, and thus new hungry people in the future, who overpopulate the world and drive it into total destruction. Thus people are bred in catastrophic numbers, who cannot help themselves in any manner and cannot feed themselves, who produce epidemics and many deaths, who destroy the whole world in every respect and increase all misery without support, in order to finally flood those countries, which show a lower population density and a certain life security for their own population. All this really should not be helped in any manner, because it is absolutely life-destroying and criminal. Aid should be given alone where it is appropriate and only in a manner that is appropriate for people to work and earn their own living.
I can only agree with your remarks in every respect.
Then another question, which refers to the third global conflagration, to the Third World War. For a long time there was always talk about the threat of a third world conflagration, and that it was almost inevitable. Towards the mid-1980s, however, you increasingly let it be known that the danger of a third world war had been contained. On the one hand, because of our peace meditation, which is carried out by many billions of people of your federation together with us. And on the other hand, because you let certain impulses work on the terrestrial human beings, which inspired them to think more sensibly. What about the danger of a third world war today?
At present, no facts point to such a threatening event. And if the entire guidelines of earthly governments and human beings in general, which are given in this regard, continue to keep and develop within the given framework, then the danger of a third world conflagration might be contained for the time being. The terrestrial human, however, is still tremendously fickle, domineering, autocratic, and unsteady, which is why it is not absolutely certain that a world conflagration will not be triggered again in the time to come. It is now urgently necessary that multinational peacekeeping troops are finally created according to the Henoch system, which immediately and promptly intervene worldwide, always and immediately in every country, and create peace and order. Where wars or revolutions threaten or break out, or where despots and dictators, etc., drive their inhumane being. But these troops should also be responsible for fighting crime and organized crime, and for ensuring that all measures to be taken to combat overpopulation are strictly adhered to. We have already talked about this in a different context.
Thank you. My next question relates to the freezing or shock freezing of all kinds of life forms. If, for example, a person is shock frozen for any reason, perhaps to overcome time, etc., then I assume that this person is in a kind of apparent death. This means, however, that the spiritual form does not leave the body, but remains in it until the time when the body is revived. Am I right in my assumption? To my knowledge, you yourself have used such methods in the past, have you not?
That is correct, as is your explanation. If the body of a material form of life would die through shock freezing, etc., or simply be abandoned by the spiritual form, then this spiritual form would not return to the corresponding body again, but would enter the afterlife realm, from where it would then enter an absolutely new body again for the purpose of reincarnation. Once a spirit form has left a body, it never returns to the body it has left, but without exception selects only the new body destined for the next life.
This also clarifies the stupid assertions of all those who say that they themselves or others have been clinically dead, seen the afterlife, etc., and yet have returned to the deceased body and revived it again.
This is nonsense if it is assumed that clinical death can be equated with actual death. The truth for such assertions is truthfully that the supposedly deceased were only in the state of a false death, in which the spiritual form remains in the body while the material consciousness works underground, generating dreams, visions, etc. Apparent deaths are usually declared clinically dead by earthly physicians. But the whole body truthfully lives on only in a tremendously slowed-down functional state, which earthly physicians are not yet able to determine.
Then this is also clear. For some time there has been talk that radio telephones are dangerous for humans because of the radio waves. Is this really the case? Or is it once again an attempt by certain elements to ruin the lives of radio telephone owners? I also have one in my car, as you know, which is why I want to be sure if it can damage my health.
Radio waves are indeed harmful to human health, as is the case with animals and plants. Strong radio wave transmitters can damage life forms of all kinds over very long distances, including mature trees and elephants as well as whales, if they are hit by the radio waves. In addition to the pollution of the environment of known species, a certain radio wave interference plays a part in the so-called tree death, which is partly to blame, especially where the radio waves occur more frequently or in a concentrated manner, such as at locations or within the range of strong radio wave transmitters, etc. In particular, the antennas of such transmitters or receivers are the most important factors in this respect because they are the source of destructive and damaging forces. This is a fact which also applies to electric current and thus to electrical installations such as transformers, lines, generators and devices as well as apparatuses to a lesser or greater extent, which is why humans should not be in the direct vicinity of such technical achievements and should not live near them for long periods of time. The stronger the systems, etc., the greater the safety distance must be calculated, which can be several kilometers for a power plant or a large transformer system, for example. Antennas for radio waves can, depending on the strength of the transmission or reception range, spread their damaging or even destructive effect hundreds of meters or even a few kilometers away through the swinging waves that transport the dangerous forces within themselves. When life forms, and especially humans, are hit by these forces, they react just as much as animals and plants of all kinds. Among many other health-damaging manifestations, the consequences of being struck by these forces are tumors, such as cancer, abortions, cardiac arrhythmia, immunodeficiency symptoms, psycho, and circulatory disturbances, damage to vision and hearing, as well as brain damage. This applies wherever strong forces are transmitted to life forms by the electromagnetic swinging waves, including in the case of radio telephones, where the transmission of forces via the antenna is not very far-reaching. So, in the case of smaller devices, it is sufficient to keep the antenna approx. 16 centimeters away from the head in order not to be hit directly by the damaging forces. If antennas of radio telephones or radios as well as TV sets, etc., are brought into the direct area of the head, The head and brain organs warm up because the antenna forces, penetrating from outside, produce a heat generation which is not beneficial to the head and brain organs, but very harmful.
The antenna of my radio telephone is mounted outside on the roof of the car, while I have an open microphone inside the car through which I can speak without having to take the handset off the device. The same applies to the speaker that is built into the device and that I do not have to take to my ear.
That is very wise, because you will not be damaged by the whole apparatus.
Then the next question. To what extent are crystals or semi-precious stones or precious stones as well as minerals and ores, etc. useful for human health promotion, etc.? Are even smaller pieces such as pendants or the like sufficient?
Certainly all materials exhibit swinging waves, but these are so low in smaller objects that they are unable to produce a significant or recognizable effect in a health-promoting or consciousness-promoting form, neither in the shorter nor in the longer term. In addition, these materials as a whole have the property of being charged with the human negative swinging waves, which can only be removed by a very specific purification process, as you, but not Earth humans, know. These materials can only unfold useful positive forces to a sufficient extent if they are large enough, whereby you know the mass to my knowledge.
Yes, they are known to me. Also the very long times which are necessary for a good effectiveness, and which are in no wise in accordance with the charlataneries and the deceits which are practiced by crystal and minerals, as well as ore and gemstone users and talisman producers, etc. These swindlers and charlatans know and understand nothing about the fact that very often only the materials ground to flour lead to certain successes when they are ingested.
That is unfortunately the truth.
Another question. Have there been any bases or stations of aliens on Venus or Mars during the last 1,000 years, or perhaps on Mercury or any other planet of the Sol system, or perhaps on the Earth's moon?
Except on Earth and on the Earth's moon, no.
And were these stations related to different extraterrestrials?
On the Earth, they all belong to us without exception, while on the Earth's satellite there were also four bases, which belonged to space-traveling peoples who had no connection to us, but who had very little contact with Earthlings, which in no wise refers to modern times.
But that reminds me, we were talking about your directives, by which you are bound to contacts with certain life forms or life forms of certain stages of development, in such a form that you are not allowed to come into direct contact with them. Nevertheless, you have made an attempt via me to contact the American government. How does this harmony with your instructions, etc.?
As you know, the connection between the American government and us could only have been such that you would have acted as a neutral mediator without having made an appearance ourselves. We would have been allowed by the directives to do this in a form of contact and connection.
Understood. But now something completely different again. Recently I was asked which genera or types of life forms would have a sexual life. This happened in connection with allegations that the U.S. Americans had captured alien human life forms in a crash of a UFO or interplanetary missile, whereby these alien life forms had no sexual organs, no excrement outlets, no visible food intake, etc.
Which of course is complete nonsense for any material form of life. Wherever it may be in the entire universe requires a possibility of food intake, a possibility of the ejection of indigestible products, etc., and thus of excrement ejection. But with all materially existing forms of life of a higher kind, and so especially with human forms of life, it is given that they have a sexual organ or a reproductive organ.
That was also my answer, which I gave to the questioner. As Svath already taught me when I was a still 3 cheeses high, a little guy, there are no higher life forms in the entire universe that do not reproduce sexually and do not have reproductive organs visible on the body. In contrast, only the lowest forms of life would reproduce independently and without sex life. This self-reproduction, which is practically the result of cell division, and which also knows no sex instinct, is only peculiar to the lowest forms of life, which are incapable of evolution in any form. Higher forms of life, however, such as the terrestrial human being, or even more highly developed humans of extraterrestrial origin, have all visible sex or reproductive organs, and all these alone are capable of evolution in any form. This means that only those life forms are capable of evolution in any form which also have physical reproductive organs, and thus a sex life and a sex drive. It is also these forms of life alone which can adapt organically and physically to the ever-changing nature and environment in such a manner as to conform to it. A certain intelligence is also associated with this development, which is naturally graded according to the form of life in question. If it can be higher or lower, that is to say purely drive and instinct-based, as is usually the case with animals, but then also consciously controlled, as is the case with all forms of human life existing in the universe. Only forms of life that can be classified as higher or high are capable of development, whereby all these higher or high forms of life without exception have sexual or reproductive organs, as well as a sexual instinct, and thus a sexual life, whereby the sexual organs or reproductive organs appear visibly on the body, even if, for example, they are not in the same state as the human body. When, for example, a human life form should already have evolved to such an extent that a transfer of semen from the male to the female life form, affected by the power of consciousness, can be carried out, but this is not customary, not even among those capable of this, but only in certain cases as an exception. Svath also explained to me that in about 20% of all existing life forms in the universe as a whole, they have to be classified as higher or high, and that without exception they also have sexual organs and exercise a corresponding sexual life. Even all highly developed human life forms that still have a material body. The other 80% correspond only to low and lowest forms of life, which are not capable of sexual reproduction, and also do not have any sexual organs and therefore cannot reproduce sexually, nor can they evolve. Their proliferation occurs solely through cell division, which is only characteristic of the lower and lowest forms of life, although mutations may occur as a result of certain influences in the cell division process.
Your words need no further explanation, for they are correct in every detail and detailed enough to be understood in good form.
Then a question about the blood groups in humans. Do all blood groups usually exist equally differently among all peoples? Or is one or the other blood group more pronounced among one or the other?
The natural rule is that a certain blood group is always predominant among a certain people, whereas mixed blood groups appear only among mixed peoples, whereby such mixed peoples can often no longer be recognized as such in recent times, because their mixing already took place in ancient times.
Actually, I already know the answer to my next question, but because it is often addressed to me, I would like to ask it, in Florida somewhere, namely in Gulf Breeze. A certain W is talking about himself, who claims that he photographs UFOs and has had some experiences with UFOs, etc. There is also a book with corresponding photos and allegations, etc. What is it?
All this nonsense is well known to me. It is all just a big fake lie and fraud of a charlatan and fame addict.
That is how I assessed everything. Then to the next question, still at Simyase's time, which emerges from the contact report of the 3rd of January 1981. Extraterrestrial people from the planet Hastur appeared in the terrestrial airspace, which travels in the system Garin of the galaxy Genan. It was said that these travelers at that time were interested in making contact with some Earthlings. However, I heard nothing more about it and assumed that this did not happen.
Your assumption is correct. We ourselves have tried to enlighten the Hasturans, after which they gave up their project and left Earth again without having achieved anything.
Andron, I have not seen the twerp for a long time. Where is he now?
He has some tasks to fulfill on the planet Canadin.
So? And where is this planet speeding through the world space, if you may ask?
About 161,000 light-years from Earth in a system we call Naranka.
You are once again sparse with information. What is the galaxy called?
Sundayaris. It is known to earthly astronomical science in this space-time structure as the neighboring galaxy Magellanic Cloud.
Let me greet him dearly, also all others, if that is possible for you next time. Ah, yes, you also keep, among many other things, records of what happened in relation to the murder of Earthlings by the Christian religion. Are you familiar with the exact number, I mean to this day?
Your question concerns one of my areas of interest, so I can give you precise information. If we divide the individual areas, then the following results. With regard to the direct influence and the direct guilt of the Christian religion, whereby Catholicism in particular must be mentioned as the main guilty factor, as for example by the Inquisition and church courts, etc. According to our record since the existence of the Christian church and religion, 62,214 people have been murdered by them. By the 31st of December 1992, a further 37,817 people had lost their lives as a result of Christian religious wars, in contrast to 28,104 by all other religions, whereby in the case of these other religions it does not refer to the period from the year 1 AD to today, but to the period of the last 3,000 years. With regard to delusional and fanatical acts of murder resulting from Christian religious aspects, 12,716 people have been murdered since the existence of the Christian religion of each category, in contrast to 8.2 million of all other religions and sects, etc., for 3,000 years. It is clear from this that the Christian religion in its main lines and with all its hundreds of sects is the predominantly bloodiest religion on the earth, which finds no parallels at all.
By delusional and fanatical acts of murder, you mean acts of murder through human beings who are religiously delusional or fanatical, etc., in order to clarify the matter.
That is right.
Well, thank you. Then my next question. In certain things since my breakdown in 1982, I have some gaps in my knowledge that I cannot simply close again.
Which is understandable, for you were not only closer to death than to life, and this for several years, but you also suffered an amnesia, through which you lost a great deal of knowledge, but which you corrected again to a great extent through your incredible efforts of reworking almost all abilities and all knowledge. So, if there are still some small gaps, it is a miracle that they are not bigger. For my part, I have to admit, I would not have been able to perform this tremendous feat.
You are too kind with your praise. So please do not do that and answer me the following question. When creation was created by the Big Bang, it must have been that the explosion speed was much higher than just 147 times the speed of light. In my opinion, the first velocity, the center explosion expansion speed, if I may call it that, must have been the speed of creation, and 10 to the power of 7,000 times the speed of light. Otherwise, it would not have been possible that the enormous vastness of the universe could have come into being. That is right, or?
Of course.
Of course. Really cannot be any different. But how long did this speed last? In my opinion, it must have been just 1 second, or even just 1 nano moment. Because if I consider that creation is able to cross the whole universe with one thought due to its 10 to the power of 7,000 times the speed of light practically in a nano moment or even in no decompression time, if I may call it that, then my assumption should actually apply. It should be noted, however, that the explosion started from a center and spread ovoidly, so that the nano moment for 10 to the power of 7,000 times the speed of light only applies to the radius. while in reality the double expansion must be measured from the center, because during the nano moment, the universe spread ovoidly to all sides. So a nano moment to all sides in an ovoid frame.
It is amazing again and again how you can put the facts and things together again, although you had lost the corresponding knowledge through amnesia. Amazing.
Beautiful. I am glad that I was right in my considerations. Which unfortunately cannot be said of earthly astronomers who still claim that the universe is only 1820 billion 18,000 to 20,000 years old, and that they have advanced to the ends of the universe with their research. All of them have no idea that the universe is divided into 7 belts, and that they are so far-reaching that they can never explore them with their primitive means. So they also do not know that they can only make their observations and do their research in the belt of matter, which of course has certain limits and to which it is very possible to reach. But not yet for the terrestrial human being, because nevertheless, these limits are still far too far away for them to be grasped and fathomed from Earth by apparatus or instrument, etc.
That is also true.
This week I read in some newspaper or magazine that various diseases are on the rise again because the traditional medications are no longer effective, which for many years or even decades contained or destroyed these various diseases.
This is indeed true, but these incidents are due to time and the tremendously growing overpopulation. The more human beings there are, the more uncontrolled the various diseases can spread among them. The drugs used against them become more and more ineffective because in the course of time the viruses and bacteria immunize themselves against the substances used against them and adapt to them. This in turn results in a mutation of the viruses and bacteria, etc., which develop new attack techniques against the body and against the organs, which as a rule have no means of defense against it, because the immune system itself must first create new defense bodies, which can act effectively against the mutated attackers. This is all an inevitable consequence of overpopulation, against which nature is beginning to defend itself, whereby traditional and very effective medicines are slowly but surely becoming completely useless against diseases that could previously be effectively combated and contained. Thus, old and long since contained diseases break through again and spread rapidly. In the near future, this will lead to an overabundance of diseases long believed to have been eradicated, as well as to the increasing ineffectiveness of well-tried medications. Even new epidemics can no longer be prevented, which will slowly enter the terrestrial human race. Also, the large use of medicines by greedy doctors, which is only too gladly made out of profit-seeking, as well as the general abuse of medicines by addicts and other drug addicts contribute to a very large extent to the fact that the pathogens become resistant against the medicines and change in such a manner that they and their offspring mutate into new dangerous pathogen factors, which are no longer compatible with the traditional and once very effective medicines and vaccines, etc. This also applies to Legionnaire's disease, which is caused by Legionella and is usually fatal for humans. These are pathogens which, as a result of too lax attention and inadequate disinfection, as well as obvious negligence on the part of the human beings responsible, who are to be found in all branches of medicine and in all their auxiliary personnel, have been able to appear, especially in ventilation and air conditioning systems, etc., and which are also responsible for the death of the human being, are the main breeding grounds of dangerous pathogens, from where they spread everywhere and infect people where they are offered this opportunity, such as in hospitals and other places where ventilation and air conditioning systems are available. The ideal temperature for these pathogens is between 25 and 60 degrees Celsius. Even diseases that are specifically located in other countries, such as malaria, etc., are spreading more and more, and also in mutated form in countries where these diseases originally had no significance whatsoever. Especially international transport companies as well as tourist companies are to be blamed for this, as well as the tourists themselves. Through transportation and tourism, as well as by refugees, asylum seekers and emigrants, etc., pathogens are carried and brought into countries which were not originally affected by these diseases or did not contain any pathogens of these diseases. In addition to the diseases themselves, their pathogens, as well as insects and other vermin-carrying pathogens, are also smuggled in and transmitted to humans and animals.
However, the mixture of the peoples is to be also mentioned, whereby also hereditary factors cause changes, by which humans become ever more susceptible to any kind of pathogens, and thus to diseases. Mixing peoples is not as harmless as the average citizen and those responsible and scientists, etc., assume. It is therefore never the language of the matter, even when the problem of mixing peoples is raised, which is becoming more and more apparent as a result of the rapid increase in overpopulation. The fact that the immune system is reduced in its power when people of different peoples mix is largely unknown to those responsible on the earth and to scientists, as well as to the normal people. If the mixing is carried out on a small scale, if, for example, here and there two people of genetically different peoples or races mix, as in the case of marriage, etc., then this does not carry much weight, even if immune system weaknesses are already recognizable there, if one researches them carefully. But if the mixing takes place on a larger scale, for example, since decades by the nature of seasonal workers and other foreign workers, as well as by refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants and tourists, etc., then the problem already becomes a farce, because not only immune system weakness, but also false humanism and many other evils arise from it, not to mention the inexorably rising mass of the overpopulation, which is a growing and ever more nutritious soil for all evils, destruction, annihilation, degeneration of all kinds, and for all kinds of diseases. The fact that allergies, tuberculosis, plague, malaria, AIDS and other venereal diseases, as well as cholera and many other plagues, epidemics and diseases have been on the increase again for a long time, and are epidemic-like is therefore not surprising if all the aspects connected with them are carefully examined and considered. That is true, is it not?
Of course, there is not the slightest doubt about that.
Of course not. It is the same with the wood tick, too. With the ticks, I mean. These have also become more aggressive in recent decades, and today many more of these animals are infested by viruses and bacteria that are more dangerous to human beings than was the case in the past. Sometimes the pathogens transmitted by the wood ticks are so aggressive that not only the health of humans, but even their lives can be threatened, as is the case with flies and mosquitoes, etc., who inject their victims with a blood-thinning liquid through their stinging, boring trunks, which serves to enable the animals to suck the blood at all, because it is normally too viscous. But it is precisely this blood-thinning fluid that is injected into the victims, and in this case into the humans, by viruses and bacteria that are dangerous to their health. Contrary to this, it should occur somewhat differently with ticks, as I have read, because with these the viruses and bacteria should be located in the inner organs, which should only reach the body of the victim when the wood tick is crushed by finger pressure or tweezers, whereby the organs burst, and the pathogens only then reach the victim through the trunk of the tick. A medical version that does not seem very obvious to me, because I myself had a completely different experience. I was not only bitten very often by mosquitoes and biting flies, but also by malaria mosquitoes, spiders and ticks, whereby I did not squeeze the ticks with my fingers or tweezers when removing them, but logically scrape them with a needle on the trunk and head, and thus remove them. Nevertheless, I suffered from infections that I had to treat with antibiotics, drugs that are becoming more and more ineffective and lose their effect more and more against all those diseases, etc., which could be treated very well and with great success in the past.
Of course, it is absurd to claim that ticks would only transmit the viruses and bacteria contained in them to the human body if they were squeezed by finger or instrument pressure. Because truthfully, they already release bacteria and viruses through the bite alone, which get into the body of the victim.
But the victims do not always have to be humans only, because animals can also be the victims, especially through ticks, which usually appear more and more frequently in the grass and on the bushes of forest edges, but also through mosquitoes, flies and horseflies, of which no one actually speaks, although they can also carry and transmit disease carriers, quite apart from the fact that their appearance alone is a plague for humans and animals.
Which also corresponds to correctness.
Well, then we can turn to something else again. On the Earth, there are about 6,000 languages worldwide, as well as about 2 or 3 artificial world languages, or world auxiliary languages, or universal languages, like the Volapük, the Esperanto, the Edo, the Interlingua, and the Novial. Not 2 or 3, but 5 of them, if I may correct myself. But what is actually the meaning of my words is that only 2 or 3 are still in use, but not popular. The question now is this: do you also have a universal language in your federation? And if so, how is it called, and how many languages are spoken in your federation as a whole?
We have a universal or federation language, of course. However, this is not only spoken in certain circles of higher offices, as is the case with earthly artificial languages, but it is common with everyone. Samti is what the language is called by us, and as such it is learnt from the ground up by every member of the Federation as a second mother tongue in childhood. Because in addition to this, of course, the native mother tongue of the respective peoples still exists. The total number of our Federation-wide languages is 127,603.
Well, then I would like to know what your new travel and transport options are. How does this transmitter system work, and how long will it take to get it up and running?
Do you see this little device integrated into the chest of my clothes?
You mean this little matchbox-sized thing?
Yes.
It is hard to tell that from the clothes. Without my flashlight, I could not see it at all. It is not noticeable at all.
This enables me to generate a transmitter gate via thought power, which I can simply step through, after which I am already at my destination without any loss of time, even if this is billions of light years away. More precisely, I have to concentrate my thoughts in such a manner that they are picked up by the device and amplified to such an extent that the resulting powers create the transmitter gate through which my transmission to the destination is made possible. The system is not yet fully operational and usable, but we are constantly experimenting with it for testing purposes by transporting objects, etc., in this manner. The required target data are created by the personal knowledge of the destination, which is then mentally programmed by the device, whereupon the transmitter gate is created in the form that the destination appears as a gate into which one can directly enter and is immediately at the destination. If the destination is unknown to one in such a kind and wise that one knows it neither by picture information nor by having ever being there personally, then mathematical coordinates are sufficient, which one enters into the device by thought power and which must be known to one naturally. If you like, I can give you a small demonstration of the possibility of such a transmitter gate. However, you must promise me that you will not let yourself be carried away by your indomitable thirst for adventure, and that you will simply step into the gate, because it is not yet fully developed for human transmissions, and can therefore still be dangerous. The danger still exists that transmitted objects, etc., do not reach their destination, but disappear somewhere untraceable and not retrievable between the dimensions, and thus get lost.
Okay, I promise. Show me what your wonder thing can do.
Can I fulfill a wish for you as to what you want to see through the transmitter gate as a destination? Maybe something you know?
Would it be possible for you to open the gate to Ketzel's house where the fountain is at the pond?
That represents no problem because the place is well known to me. Look.
Fantastic. 2 steps, and I would be on Ketzel's terrain on Era. Look, Ketzel's Ulrak passes. By the way, where did he get this little cattle from? And can that not suddenly enter the transmission gate and get lost here?
It is an animal that lives on Era. It cannot come here, because the gate is only visible from here on the one hand, but not from the other side, and on the other hand, it can only be used from this side. This has been designed for safety reasons to prevent unwanted life forms from passing through the gate. If it were different, it would be very dangerous. On the other hand, the gate can only exist as long as it is thought to exist.
It seems to be early evening over there.
That is right.
And how far is this gate visible here? I mean, if there is someone up there on the street looking over here. Can you see it then?
There is no danger, because the transmission gate is only visible on a few steps. Go back only once 3 steps, then you will not see it anymore.
Actually, it is not even a flicker or anything else to see. Wait, yes, now I see it again.
Good, then I will finish my demonstration now.
Gone. Man, that is impressive. Simply fantastic.
It is also impressive for us.
And, is this technique of transport then the absolute ultimate for all time, or is a further development still possible?
The development only ends where the power of consciousness alone is sufficient to transport oneself and materials of all kinds by teleportation or telekinesis from a point of departure to a specific destination, without any technical aids being required. This also means that you do not need any spacecraft, etc., to move from one place to another or to transport materials from one place to another. The next development, however, will be to find and use the means to move from one place to another without a transmission gate, and to do so solely by the power of thought, which is technically amplified in such a manner that teleportation can be carried out that can bridge billions of light years, as well as the technology of transmitters that is now emerging. Nevertheless, even then, the spacecraft will still be needed, which will also be further advanced in development.
And everything is based on the speed of creation, 10 to the power of 7,000 times the speed of light. Even with the present transmitter gate, this cannot be any different.
That is not quite correct, because for the time being, it is based only on 21,000 times the speed of light. Besides, the speed of the spirit should never be reachable by technical means.
The size of the gate is about 2 meters by 90 centimeters, and...
You hit the measure very accurately. That is amazing.
It is not amazing, because I have some practice in estimating masses. But what I wanted to ask, for a human, the gate is just good in size. But what if a larger gate is needed, such as for large goods and the like?
The size of the transmitter gate can be customized according to need. This is done by a simple command, mentally directed to the gate generator device.
Fabulous. It really could not be simpler. But what happens now? If somebody takes over the transmitter gate generating device without authorization? Is there perhaps a safety device, as you use it with your weapon tools, that only the owner of the device can use it because it is tuned to their thought frequency?
That is so, as you say. This alone guarantees the best possible security, so that no one can use the devices for unfair and nonsensical purposes without authorization. Should they fall into unauthorized hands for any reason, if we are active on worlds whose human beings cannot yet be expected to use such devices?
As is the case on Earth, for example, yes?
That is right.
Well, now you also have devices and the like, which look like a simple piece of metal or plastic, etc., without these being recognizable as devices or instruments, but in which there are high-quality super mini electronics, which again are not recognizable as such if you cut the metal or the plastic, because everything is poured into each other. Is there not the possibility that through some circumstances the truth can be found out?
This danger does not exist, not even on the Earth. Because in order to be able to fathom this technology, earthly scientists would have to have knowledge and technology that would be 7,500 years in the future for them.
That means that over the last 18 years you have made progress approaching 4,000 years, right?
It is 216 years more, yes.
But this can only have happened through the friends of Asket's people. If I see the matter correctly, namely those friends who are ahead of Asket's people by about 4,000 years, that is to say 4,216 years in technological development.
That is also true, but I must enlighten you about the fact that also the peoples of the Estrish Asket have attained the entire higher development of the 4,216 years.
Powerful news, my friend. But you have never told me that you have made such tremendous progress in the development of technology.
You never asked for it either.
That again also corresponds to the truth. But can I ask you again about the weather, the droughts and floods, earthquakes, volcanic activity, forest fires, storm surges and storms, etc.?
So ask your question.
There are actually two of them, if you take it exactly. How will all the effects and impacts of the things I have mentioned unfold in the future?
These will become more extreme and more destructive as time goes on, and Switzerland will also be affected, especially by storms, etc., as well as by snowfall into lower altitudes, as will be the case this summer in the coming month of July. In a few days' time, the conditions for climate change will begin all over the world, with droughts in one area and floods in the other, while forest fires will occur elsewhere, and they will become more frequent. Storm surges will also be devastating, usually triggered by earthquakes or seaquakes, as will be the case in Japan when an earthquake measuring approximately 7.6 to 7.9 on the Richter scale will shake the land and sea near Hokkaido on the 12th of July, killing some 300 human lives.
And the blame for all this lies with Earth humans through their overpopulation, which damages and destroys all of nature, as well as the planet itself. The Earth begins to defend itself more and more against this human madness, but nevertheless, nobody pays attention to it. The irresponsible ones of all classes even claim that all these events are in no wise related to overpopulation.
This is also true, but what was your second question?
I wanted to ask you if you could give some information for the second half of the year. If you wanted to give some predictions?
There is not enough time, because I have to say goodbye now, if you do not have some personal questions that I can answer briefly. On the other hand, I find that such predictions have in no way borne fruit so far, which is why we should refrain from such predictions in the future. They are useless for the human beings of the planet Earth because nobody cares about them.
Well, so be it. However, I still have a few personal questions that would be important for me to answer. Partly they also refer to group members.
Then, our official conversation should now be finished.